Yeah, I think you're here.
All right.
Hello, hello. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Hi, everybody. Really excited for this conversation today. My name is Jad Abumrad. I, about 20 years ago, created a show called Radio Lab, which is on a lot of radio stations, and have done some Nashville-specific podcasts like Dolly Parton's America. Thank you. And I am actually here today as your moderator for a very important and difficult conversation, which is free expression. In this moment in history, how should we think about freedom of expression, free speech? Should there be limits? If so, what should those limits be? How can history be our guide? And what does this have to do with you, students? And I'm thinking not just of the folks in the room, but the first years that are coming in, as you will inevitably find yourself in uncomfortable conversations, because that's what college is about. It is about exploring other people's minds, which can be uncomfortable, and what are the guardrails around those kinds of situations. We will not solve anything tonight, I should disclaim, because this is a conversation that's been going on since ancient Greece. This is, I guess, just consider it one more step in the experiment. But we're going to draw on the wisdom and experience of our three panelists here. So let me introduce them. I'm going to first start with the fellow who is really the catalyst for this evening. Jacob Mchangama is the founder and director of Justitia. Did I say that correctly? Which I believe is Danish for justice.
Yeah, or the Roman goddess of justice.
Okay. That is a human rights think tank. He's a lawyer and a visiting scholar at Columbia's Global Freedom of Expression Center. He's written a lot on free speech and human rights, and it's been published in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. And I think more for our purposes, he is the author of a book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. I have to tell you, I fell down a major rabbit hole with this book. I've been reading it for the last 3 weeks, and I have become so engrossed in the characters in this book that I've begun to teach myself to draw by drawing all of these characters. So I would just encourage you all to do the same. Read the book, draw all the characters. It's an amazing way to immerse yourself in the history of freedom of expression, and it is a long and complicated history. And I believe, as I understand it, Jacob and Chancellor Diermeier were at a party, and they got to talking, and apparently the conversation got very intense, and the Chancellor decided that conversation needed to continue, and so here we are. Our second panelist is Chancellor Daniel Diermeier, Vanderbilt University's 9th Chancellor, Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He has written 4 books, more than 100 research articles in academic journals on subjects ranging from political theory, political science, applied mathematics, economics, linguistics, sociology, psychology, computer science. It's dizzying, frankly. Before Vanderbilt, he served in leadership and faculty roles at the Stanford School of Business, the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern, and Dean of the Harris School of Public Policy. And from 2016 to 2020, he was the Provost at the University of Chicago, where I imagine he witnessed many free speech kerfuffles. So the Chancellor brings a very particular blend of philosophy, business know-how, and I suspect he'll bring all of that to bear in this conversation. And finally, we have Professor Tiffiny Tung, who is the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, and Gertrude Conway, Professor of Social and Natural Sciences and Professor of Anthropology. Her work as a teacher and an administrator has her pretty much reaching into all different parts of the campus, and as a scholar, she's written 60-plus articles examining how state power, imperialism, have impacted and continue to impact indigenous people in their communities. And her work, interestingly for our purposes, lives at that very difficult intersection of history, science, and biology. And we all know at that place, that's where a lot of difficult conversations live. So I look forward to her sharing her wisdom on how she navigates that in the classroom. So please welcome our panelists. Okay. I want to begin by asking you all a very open-ended question. When it comes to fostering a culture at Vanderbilt that is open, inclusive, safe, but also one where people can roll up their sleeves and really get into it, and really sort of talk about the difficult issues, what do you define as your job? Mr. Dearmeyer, as the Chancellor of the university, what do you see as your job? Mr. Mchangama, as a historian, what do you see as your job? And Professor Tong, as somebody who is in the classroom having to navigate kids through these difficult conversations, what do you see as your job? And I'd also pose the question to all of you, as students, what do you see as your basic task when it comes to this? So mentally, you can answer the question as we go. But Chancellor, could we start with you? What's the thing that you pay attention to?
I want to, for the record.
Yes.
Jacob and I, we didn't meet in some raucous party there. We just had a cup of coffee in Copenhagen, but it was a great conversation. So I think that everything that we need to do from an academic leadership point of view should always be grounded in our values and our purpose. And our purpose as a great research university is to create an environment where there can be transformative education and path-breaking research. That's what we're all about. We're doing other things too, but at the core, that's what we do. And you cannot have a transformative education and you cannot have path-breaking research if you're not dealing with questions, with issues in a way that respects your intellectual freedom. You have to be able to push against the boundaries of what's known right now, what people believe, what's conventional wisdom, what are the arguments for a particular position. And even if you don't change your mind, that exchange will give you a much firmer foundations in the beliefs that you're going to walk away with. And that's the key at the core of everything. And you cannot have that if you don't have a culture of free expression and intellectual freedom. And then our role and your role, I love the fact that you mentioned that it's really everybody's responsibility, because at the end of the day, we can have all sorts of principles and regulation, but it's a culture of free expression and free speech that makes the whole thing work. And for us, this means we have to be very diligent about that. We have to create lots of opportunities for where this open dialogue can take place, and we also need to work on participating in that. So for example, when you have these conversations, and sometimes they can be challenging, you may go into a conversation with a very firm held belief of what's right or wrong. And that's okay, that's fine. I mean, it just makes you maybe a passionate advocate for a particular cause. But it's important, and this distinguishes a discussion, from a kind of debate, which tends to be much more confrontational, that you also need to listen to the other side, understand what they're saying, and be willing to be convinced, right? I mean, going into a conversation or a discussion has to have the possibility that somebody else may have an argument or a set of data or something like that you haven't considered and that you change your mind. And the openness to that, I think, deep down, is at the core for what a transformative education is all about. And that requires a commitment, clarity of purpose, values that support that, but also importantly a culture that we understand that we're all members of a living, learning community, and we all have a responsibility to make sure that these principles can live and can support what we all hold dear.
How about you? Same question. Either. You guys can.
So I'll build on some things that the Chancellor was saying, and I'll kind of bring it to the ground in the classroom. So I'll start with this very important premise that professors care very deeply about their craft, right? We care really deeply about what goes on in the classroom, right? We value our scholarship. It's what drives us, right? It's our calling, and we want to share that scholarship with our students, and we want to share the scholarship of our colleagues with our students. And so we care very deeply about what happens in the classroom, right? So I think many of you experienced this. You've seen the kind of care and thought that goes into the readings that your professors select and the kinds of conversations that they foster in the classroom. And so, one of our aims kind of on the ground, in the buildings, in the classrooms, building on what the Chancellor was saying, is we want to create these spaces, right, where we maybe do shared readings, right? So we have knowledge from which to debate each other respectfully, engage in discussions for you to learn new things, and also to generate new ideas, right? We really want to foster this notion that you too are scholars, right, and can generate innovative ideas and help us rethink some long-held beliefs or long-held scientific standards, right, that shape many disciplines. So, that's a really key thing that professors see as a guiding principle for them. And we work really hard to make sure that you have the space to communicate and share ideas and disagree with the professor, right, and disagree with your peers. Now it can sometimes, and it can take, it can look different in each classroom, right, and it varies on the topics. We have pedagogical practices, right, or like teaching methods that we can deploy, right, to make sure that all of our students feel like they can engage in respectful debate, right, and express dissenting views or unpopular views, or also just ask questions that some people might think like, it's, quote unquote, a dumb question, or maybe they just don't have the foundation. Like, my job as a professor is to make sure that you feel like you are in a space where you can ask all of those kinds of questions and question people's ideas. Maybe later, if there's time, I can talk about some of the pedagogical practices that professors deploy to try to foster that kind of open forum and open debate. And then, maybe later we can talk about examples, and I'm sure all of you would have examples that you could share in terms of moments where maybe you were a little shy, right? You maybe felt you were a little concerned about expressing your idea, right? But your professor was helping to pull it out of you, right? And that's our job, right? We got to pull these ideas out of you and get you to raise your hand. I will tell you, how when the professor will ask a question and there's that long silence? We train ourselves, right, to get really comfortable with silence so that we can, I see some professors nodding their heads, because we know it takes a little moment for somebody to ask that uncomfortable question, right? And that's something that we work really hard at and continue to try to foster. So, maybe later we can talk about concrete examples too.
Absolutely. Jacob, I'm curious to hear from you as a historian in this moment with all of the conversation around, just to borrow a phrase from your book, with the free speech recession, the receding of open dialogue spaces. As a historian, as somebody who wrote the book, what were you paying attention to the most?
Well, I think what I'm particularly concerned about in open democracies and societies today is the danger of taking free speech for granted, that we don't realize that the freedom to discuss, to criticize, to have a protest yesterday at the Founders Walk is not something that you should take for granted. It's come at great cost, and that we're standing on shoulders of people who paid an enormous sacrifice for that. And being in the South, that to me, when I wrote the book, was particularly eye-opening, the way that restrictions on free speech and censorship was an instrumental part of racial segregation, and how free speech was used as a weapon, if you like, to break down some of those barriers, so that I can sit in front of you as an audience, an incredibly diverse group of students and people, and that would just not have been possible not that long ago. And I think sometimes it's tempting to forget about the progress that we've made, because we continue to have challenges and problems, and sometimes we get tempted by our censorious nature to say, well, these people are attacking the ideas that we hold most dear, and therefore we have to try to silence them or shut them out, when in fact free speech in many ways, I think, is maybe the most powerful engine of human equality that humankind has ever stumbled upon, and that's why I think that it's incredibly important that we hold on to it, and that is not to ignore all the harms and costs, especially in our digital age, that free speech can also facilitate, but that you have it within your power to use free speech to counter many of those harms, to work together to expose misinformation, to counter hateful rhetoric. And so don't give up on those hard-won victories because they are a part and parcel of open societies, and especially at universities. Universities do not make a lot of sense if you aren't able to challenge just about any idea, and also to be brave, to be grateful that you're sometimes pushed beyond where you're comfortable, because in hindsight, likelihood is that you'll be grateful that someone challenged your ideas, because I think it would be a tragedy if you paid a lot of money to get into college and you leave with the very same ideas that you held, the same convictions that you held when you started, when you graduate. So yeah.
Well, let me pick up on what you just said, and also, really, the three of you sort of pointed at this. For example, Chancellor, you said that what's most important is that we enter these conversational spaces and be willing to push against our own inherent assumptions, but also those we're speaking to. That requires a certain mindset that you're asking of the student body, to be brave, as you say, to be willing to play. But it strikes me that to be willing to play, you first have to feel that the ground underneath your feet is solid. You have to feel that you're in a safe place. So, and I guess this is a question for any of you. How do you get a student or a staff member or a faculty who is scared, tentative, afraid to raise their hand, Professor Tung, as you say, to step forward and ask that impolite question, to take the risk? How do you encourage that?
Who do you like to go first?
Hey, let's all talk at once, if it were up to me.
All right, I'll start. So our motto is Dare to Grow. And I love the fact that you just mentioned courage. And growth doesn't just happen, and learning and development doesn't just happen. It requires effort, but it also requires courage. And I think asking a question when you think it's a dumb question because you don't understand, you think everybody else understands, and it turns out that very question is really fundamental and opens up a whole line of questioning that requires courage. It definitely requires courage to be able to challenge a professor and say, I don't understand the argument. I don't see it that way. How about we see it this way? That requires courage. And it may even require more courage to disagree with a classmate. And what we need to watch out for, and what's all our responsibility, is to make sure that we never forget, with all the passion and with all the conviction and with all that is important to us, that we are members of one community. And that we are here because we have a common goal and a common purpose, and that we treat each other with respect. And I think what's happening right now in campuses across the country, and we're not immune from that, is that is falling by the wayside. Sometimes because we're living in such a polarized environment, but I think it goes beyond that, because somehow as a society, we have forgotten that we are part of one community. And the university is kind of special in that respect, because we live together, we learn together, so we should be able to do it more than anybody else. But it really requires everybody's commitment to a sense that we're in this together, we're all members of the Vanderbilt community, and even if we disagree with each other, we do it with respect, and with a sense that we're not forgetting that the person across from the table, maybe a faculty member, maybe a staff member, maybe a fellow student. And that's what I come back to, is like, we can do a lot of that, and we can create activities, and we create guidelines and all sorts of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's every one of our responsibilities to make sure that these values are alive and that they guide our day-to-day activities on campus.
So I was to add to that, in your point, what did you say, Jad, about how do you create the stable foundation? And I think about in a classroom setting, oftentimes what faculty will do, and this is what I do in my own experience, is I know when there's going to be some difficult conversations, I'll sequence them a little bit later in the semester, where we've had a chance. You know how you get to know your fellow students and your professor a little bit better? You wait to develop that rapport and that trust, right? And that then you can kind of share ideas more openly. That often helps, and you wait to have those tough conversations after we've established those connections with each other. Now, I get it that one could argue, well, that's not what it's like out there in the real world, right? Out there in the real world, you're going to end up in some really intense discussions or advocating for some particular policy or dealing with some amorphous institution, and you're not going to have that rapport, right, and that trust with that individual. And I would say, like, we are an institution of higher learning, right? My job is to help educate, and my job in the classroom as your professor is to help you develop that muscle, right? Help you develop those skills and habits of mind so that you can debate respectfully, right? That you've got information and data at the ready. You know how to whip it out and argue and sustain your arguments and have a counter argument, right? The classroom settings, in many ways, it's this opportunity for you to develop that muscle, right? So that we can send you out into the world and in your dorm rooms, right? And at the dining tables, and maybe at Thanksgiving with your families, right? And bring up all of those tough topics and talk about them. Like, this is what we're trying to foster in you, is the development of that muscle so that you feel comfortable in saying the uncomfortable things, right? And asking the tough questions, because that's a skill that is going to benefit you throughout the rest of your life in so many different arenas.
Can I, just to follow up on something you just said, I'm curious, in the time that you have been teaching, I'm thinking of something the Chancellor just said about what's happening across the country on college campuses. In the time that you have been teaching, have you seen a shift in subjects that are difficult to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few examples. So one example I could give, so I teach a big introduction to biological anthropology class, 165 students, and I teach Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection. And for some, that's a very controversial topic. And I do an anonymous survey in the beginning of the class, and I learn things like 86% of my students were never taught evolution in high school. Right? And then I have anonymous data, like 89% of them accept evolutionary theory and 11% do not. So here I am lecturing in front of 165 students. 11% do not believe the words coming out of my mouth as I'm teaching them about the scientific tenets of evolutionary theory. And so one of my jobs then is to, and these numbers have been so through time, these numbers have been fluctuating. Interestingly, the numbers have, maybe it's just because class size has grown. I have more students who reject evolutionary theory, which is interesting because that's different than the trends nationally. Keeping in mind my sample size only covers like 12 years, right? But still, this is a trend. I've got it all graphed out if you want the slide. But I show it to my students, right? They can see the trends, and I say, like, here you are relative to your peers that have come before you. Here you are relative to the US population. Here you are relative to the global population. And so that is one area where I've seen a shift. And what I've learned is that there are things I can do, like, I can pose a rhetorical question for maybe the student who's afraid to raise their hand and say, well, in Genesis, it says this about how Earth was formed, right? And so I can integrate that into the lecture, knowing that 11% of my students are wondering that, but are afraid to ask, to try to foster that kind of discussion. And then there's things that we can do. I think a lot of you have probably had this with your professors, have you write anonymous questions or comments on a piece of paper, right? And then they collect them, and it's a way to kind of see what some of the issues are. But so that's one example where I've actually surprisingly seen a trend that's opposite of the national trend.
That's interesting. So 11% come in, because I think the national number, correct me if I'm wrong, is much higher than that, isn't it?
Well, nationally, then 56% accept evolutionary theory. The Gallup poll, it's worded a little bit differently.
Okay.
But 56%, students in higher education, like, we're high numbers overall. So relative to the general U.S. population, 56%, according to 2019 Gallup poll, accept evolutionary theory as the origin of humanity, of humankind.
Gotcha. Yeah, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in terms of how do we. I'm just curious for you in terms of can history be our guide in terms of times where that invitation has worked, has created that sort of courageous, brave conversation. I'm just curious if anything comes to mind for you.
Yeah, so universities have sort of grappled with the red lines since the Middle Ages, when universities really came into their own. So there was a time when you could be burned at the stake as a heretic if you delved too much into Aristotelian philosophy. For instance, there was a time when a student was whipped at Harvard for blasphemy. And I think, looking back at that, I think everyone would agree that we're better off. That is no longer the case. But of course, if you look back on many disciplines that are being taught at universities, theories that were generally accepted turn out to be wrong or partially wrong. And so are some of the values that we are today. If we show a recording of this panel in 50 years, there's a likelihood that a lot of people in the future will say, wow, some of their beliefs or assumptions were crazy. They do not chime at all with what we believe in. And I think in general, that's a good thing. And how do we change our beliefs? Well, partly by talking to other people, by having our ideas and beliefs tested. So I think that we should be, you should be incredibly grateful for being in an environment where you're with incredibly smart people, great professors who can challenge you. And then when we have that sort of reaction that we all have as human beings of being told that we're wrong and we want to lash out, think of it, train yourself to be grateful, to be corrected, or at least to sort of be giving the opportunity to rethink what you believe. And then on a more general level, I think we should also, I think really of free speech as being the antithesis to violence. I mean, there's no other principle that allows human beings with very different ideas on politics, religion, philosophy, to live together in peace, even to be sort of neighbors, spouses, colleagues, friends. And there was a time not that long ago in the arc of human history where we would go to war, where we would kill people who believe differently from us. So again, appreciate that principle that you can actually learn and benefit from people with different ideas and still go out and enjoy the nightlife of Nashville and have fun rather than go to war with each other, and even be smarter throughout that process, come away thinking more clearly about things, and that you yourself can benefit others from challenging them, not sort of thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't challenge that idea because he or she will think less of me. Well, actually, you're doing that person a favor by not necessarily agreeing.
Well, I'm curious to sort of dig in a little bit on the idea of the red line here at the university. I mean, typically we think of hate speech as being that line, and I'm interested to know where all of you stand. I mean, as Chancellor, in terms of the policies that you would advocate for here at Vanderbilt, but also as somebody who has surveyed the history of free speech. I thought I pulled two different quotes from your book. Number one comes from Angela Merkel. I actually made a slide. I don't know if we can bring that up. Angela Merkel, 2019, in a speech she gave before the German parliament, she said, "We have freedom of expression in this country, but the freedom of expression has limits. And they begin where there is incitement, where hatred is spread, and where the dignity of other people is violated. We must and will oppose this." So that's her viewpoint, that we have free expression, but it ends when someone spreads hate and violates somebody else's dignity. And certainly you can imagine she was thinking of German history when she said that. Second quote that you offer, Eleanor Roosevelt, 1950. She was very circumspect about hate speech laws, believed that if we make rules about hate speech, quote, any criticism of public or religious authorities might all too easily be described as incitement to hatred and consequently prohibited. So her opinion was that if we make rules against hate speech, the authorities are simply going to use those rules against us. And any opinion that they don't like, they'll call it hate, they'll censor it, and certainly we see this happening in China, Hungary, Russia. It's happened in Britain, it's happened in America again and again. So on the Merkel-Roosevelt scale, Let me take. You know what? Let me take a poll of the audience. Who here believes in the Merkel principle that we should aggressively police hate speech? Raise your hands. Okay, not aggressively, that we should police it at all. More hands up? Okay. All right, so who here believes in the Roosevelt principle that if we aggressively or not aggressively police hate speech, it's just going to blow back against us and we should be really careful about that? Raise your hands if you believe that. Okay. What do you guys make of that?
I'm going to take the stance of principled neutrality.
So I'll just offer you sort of an anecdote, so when my father's from the Comoro Islands, it's a small island nation in Africa, and so when I was 7 or 8, we were walking down the street in a neighborhood of Copenhagen, which at the time was plagued by this gang called the Green Jackets, and so there are these Green Jackets walking on the other side of the street, and they yell at us saying, we didn't know that monkeys had moved into the neighborhood. And so you can imagine if you're 7, 8 years old, that's not particularly pleasant. And so why shouldn't those persons have been sort of prosecuted? Well, fast forward to 2015, my father has moved back to the Comoro Islands, and he is involved in an NGO, and he organizes a protest against corruption and power cuts, and he's arrested on the charge of incitement to hatred. So I think that's a pretty good example of how that can happen. And of course, there are many other examples that I document in the book of how these laws can be used to silence minorities. And I think while the impulse of wanting to protect minorities is something that we should be grateful for, that a lot of people who want to ban hate speech do so out of good intentions. I think you always have to be clear that if you're a minority and you're relying on laws to restrict free speech, you're only a political majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of such laws. And I think this current moment in the US is a great reminder of that. So go to Florida, and you will see a law targeting so-called critical race theory in higher education, public universities as well as businesses. And if you take the wording of HB 7 in Florida, it is very close to some of the wording in that you'd have in hate speech codes that have a different purpose from what the Florida legislature has in mind. So once you abandon principle, you are opening up opportunities for others. So I think it's a bit like fighting a war with poison gas. Like you drop the gas at the enemy, and then the wind shifts, and suddenly it blows back in your face. Now, this is not to say that this will always be the case, but we also, I think, have to look at, does it work? Will you eliminate racism by banning certain ideas? Are we safer not knowing what certain segments of the population believe in, even if we don't like those ideas? Does it perhaps prevent us from trying to engage with those people? I mean, look at attitudes towards interracial marriage in this country. That is one of my favorite graphs because it's such a positive story, but it hasn't come about by putting people, racists, into prison. It coincides with a time where the First Amendment was dramatically expanded, the legal protection of the First Amendment, not least due to the Civil Rights Movement, who won a number of landmark cases. So I'm happy to go into more details about sort of pros and cons of hate speech laws. But those were just some of the reservations I have about that approach.
Gotcha.
So I'll add one thing, and one thing that I think that the intuition that comes from having like regulations or laws against hate speech is that they work, right? And one thing that I learned from your book, which I didn't know, embarrassing to admit, given that I'm German by origin. But there's always the argument, if only, in the Weimar Republic there had been restrictions on speech, then the Nazis never would have had a chance to grow. What I didn't know, and you know this much better, there were tremendous restrictions on free speech in the Weimar Republic. But the Nazis used that and turned it around and now presented themselves as the prosecuted minority, and that allowed them to grow. So my own attitude on that is, there are certainly issues that we would not tolerate. Let's say the most clear are things like incitement to violence or threatening a particular individual, things like that. And that's consistent with U.S. law, and that's clear. But I think the best way to deal with these issues, is not so much by putting down more rules and regulations, but to really put a lot of confidence in our students. And having a set of common purpose, understanding that we are part of one community, and dealing with the problem when it occurs as we find it in a constructive manner seems much more useful to me than having this complicated code or that complicated code. Because it's like everybody who is that's why we have law schools, right? So we have these rules and regulations and how to interpret in this particular context. I think that very often it's more about, when we have a real issue, and there are some real issues, where we have, we foster communication or conversation between people, and that's much better than thinking about, this code or that code. And the reason why I think this is important for us is we live together. We're a community that shares so much, and that's a special case for a university. Is that we are, I said it before in passing, but it's really true, a living learning community. And what's important is that these like super intense debates, conflicts can emerge in a student community completely independent of any question of hate speech. Okay, so I'll give you two examples, both of them here at Vanderbilt. One of them was over Greek life. Okay, and you may remember, for those of you that were here at the time, how vicious the conflict was over that. Or we had a recent issue last year, which was within both Vanderbilt student government, other parts of the university, over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Where one part of our student body, both of them, by the way, the entire student body was super committed to social justice issues, but interpreted them in a different way, in a kind of Israel-Palestine side. And one part of the students were calling the other side racist, and the other calling the other side anti-Semitic. Okay. That had nothing to do with hate speech or anything like that. What it did was, people very strongly felt that they were on the right side of history and morality, and then they went at it. And that is the problem to me, right? That's the issue to me. The issue for us is to make sure that we're not tearing each other apart over an issue that we may feel strongly about, but that can create so much tension and conflict and polarization that students just refuse to talk to each other. And we did have that in both of these instances. And your preceptors, there's an important role for you, is to be part of that and to make sure that this culture of conversation, this culture of discussion, also, right, that one can see things in a different way, right? This is always the thing that is at the core of sometimes of these things, that people say, we have to see it this way, and you're with me or you're against me. That's not the way universities should function. And so, to me, it's less about this is in and that's out, and that's the code, and that's the rule, and that's the regulation, because these things can come from anywhere. To me, the critical question is remembering that we're members of one community, that treat each other with respect, and that understand that we can see things differently, even on issues that we feel passionate about, a willingness to listen, a commitment to try to convince the other side, but also a willingness to go on the conversation with a willingness to be convinced.
But Chancellor, if I may, when you have a situation where you have a very deeply entrenched difference like the Israeli and the Palestinian question, and you see that happen on campus. What's the right intervention from a university perspective or from a professor perspective?
I think the right intervention for us is to remind the students that they're part of one community, that when they came here, they're signed on to a certain set of values. And we're very clear about that. For those of you that were at Founders Walk yesterday, we talked about it very clearly, and to remind people that that's what makes the university work. And right now, in the heat of the passion and in the heat of their convictions, they're deviating from that. And to bring them back to that. That to me is the goal. Okay, and it worked. We have been able to do it very well. In another instance, this is one I think worked really well. This was a case about our women's basketball team. Some of you may have heard that. They, a year and a half ago, stayed in the locker room during the national anthem to express their concern over racial injustice in this country.
We actually have a video about this. Should we play the video?
If you have it?
It's a 2-minute video. And then
you're so prepared.
No, it's
That's
not
fantastic.
Me. Could we, okay.
Oh, great.
My name is Jordan Cambridge.
I'm Kaylin Smith, and we want to let you all know that we are incorporating Lift Every Voice and Sing following the Star Spangled Banner at our home games.
As a team, we want to bring awareness to and education of Black culture. We are hopeful that by playing this song, we can open eyes, get people thinking, and begin to make change.
Lift Every Voice and Sing was written at a time of great turmoil for Black Americans and was often used as a rallying cry during times of great civil unrest like the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.
We hope you join us in reflection during the playing of this song and its integration into the game day experience. We hope you hear it, are moved by it, and help facilitate positive change. Anchor down.
So that video actually jumps to the end of what you were saying.
Yeah,
Can you set it up?
Let me give you the context of it so that you put this in context. So they stayed in the locker room to protest racial injustice in this country. And I got a lot of angry emails from a lot of alums, in particular, some current students, but mostly alums, that said that by not going out when the national anthem is played, you're disrespecting the national anthem, you're disrespecting the country, and you're especially disrespecting the people that have served their country in the military and have given their life for it. That was the emails, okay? Very angry. And so, now now how do we think about this? Remember, we wanted to think about this from the point of view of what's our purpose, right? Our purpose, I said it before, is to have a transformative education. Our student athletes are first and foremost students. As students, we want them to be involved and engaged with the big issues of the day, and certainly the whole question and quest for racial justice is on the top of the list for the entire country and for so many of our students as well. So if they want to stay out of protest and will not go out for the national anthem, we as a university will support them, not because we support their point of view, that's principled neutrality, but because we want them to be engaged and we want them the opportunity to protest and express that. So that's the kind of traditional free speech angle, right? But it was important to us, and that brings me back to this culture that's so important to me. We want to go beyond that. Because we wanted to say, okay, how can we use that now as a moment where we can have a conversation? Rather than having two sides of our community screaming at each other, how can we remember that we're part of a living, learning community? So what we did is we have on campus 20 plus veterans. All of them have combat experience. They're the Bass Military Scholars. And these Bass Military Scholars, they're supported by the Bass family to pursue a graduate degree here, anything from the law school to nursing. And so we thought, okay, why don't we invite the basketball players and the Bass Scholars to a conversation on the question of what does it mean to be a patriot? And that was powerful, because everybody learned something about each other. You heard it from the women's basketball team, how they've been thinking about it, and their sense of patriotism, right, really harkened back to the civil rights movement and the courage it takes to fight injustice. And then they learned, on the other hand, from the veterans, is that the military people may have all sorts of point of view on the flag and the history of the flag. And the veterans learned about the experience, deep experiments of racism that these students often had experienced throughout their life, Jacob, like you were telling about your father along those lines, and yourself. That to me is great, because what it does is we were firm in our principles, but we went beyond that, and everybody walked away with a lesson that they can carry with them throughout the rest of their lives. And that's, I think, the added responsibility and purpose that we serve as an educational institution is, we shouldn't just stop at, okay, you have a right to say, you have the right to say that, but how do we foster and create dialogue so that understanding can follow? Not agreement. Doesn't mean we have to walk away and agree with that. But at the very least, that we understand where people come from, why we disagree, and that the fact that we disagree doesn't make the other side immoral or a monster.
What's very interesting to me about that instance is that it seems like as a result of that conversation that you convened, they now added Lift Every Voice and Sing as part of the, which is interesting because, I mean, it wasn't simply, should we come out for the national anthem or not? There was a creative solution.
Yes.
There was something added. And it does strike me in a lot of these cases that these are creative problems as much as they are partisan problems.
Yeah, there shouldn't be, I think we too often think of these things as exercises in arm wrestling. You know, you're screaming, I'm screaming, you're screaming, I scream, who can scream the loudest, and they win, right? And that's not what we should be about as an education institution. That doesn't mean that these things are, we can resolve all of them, these issues will go away, that we will all agree at the end of the day. But I love the way you say that it's a creative solution, because at the end of the day, it requires people to engage seriously, right? And with their whole self, and with their experience, with their perspective, with their ideas, and with their creativity to come up with a solution that's better than when we started.
All right, we are edging. I knew this would happen. There's so many questions I have in here. We didn't even get a chance to talk about principal neutrality. I was so excited to ask you questions about that. But all right, we're edging closer to time. I want to make room for you guys if you have questions. So let me throw it to y'all. If you have questions for our panelists here, also keep in mind that you will be watching this again with first years incoming. So imagine what questions they may have for our panelists. Raise your hands.
We'll have microphones too coming around there.
I'll stand. Hello, my name is Lexi. I'm a senior at Vanderbilt. Thank you all for everything you shared. I'm curious from a student's perspective to hear from each of you where you believe activism has a place on this campus and how students can engage in activism from a variety of different perspectives and with a variety of other different people while also maintaining respect and maintaining the values that our university stands for. Thank you.
Should I start with that? I'll start with that, and then people can jump in. So it's a little of a continuation for my little story there related to the women's basketball team. We want you to be passionate about issues and our students, and to be involved. And if activism is how you want to express that, wonderful. That's great. And activism, I think, can come in a variety of different ways. It can come because we want to have an impact in the world. So, you may feel about a particular policy issue really strongly, let's say the issue of gun control, and you want to be active on that, and we take an activist position, and we'll fully support you on that. And this is important to us. It's like we'll support our students and our faculty even when the water gets hot, okay? So we want our faculty to do this. We want our students to do this. So one of our distinguished faculty member, Michael Eric Dyson, he's often on these talk shows, and he says very controversial things. And I get a lot of angry emails every time, not every time, but once in a while. And my email, back to when I get these, my response is always the same, right? We believe in free expression for faculty, and that includes for what they're saying on talk shows, because we want them to engage. We want them to be out there. They want to be part of public discourse. We want their voices to be out there. And then many students choose they want to be active on campus. There's a particular issue that they care about and that they want to do, in the campus community. That's great too. I think the important part is that where things get tricky is when the type of activism that is inconsistent with the principles that the university stands for. And so the classic example of that is the controversial speaker disruption. Okay? So somebody brings let's say a faculty member brings a speaker to their class, or a student club organizes a speaker, and part of the student body doesn't like that and think that we shouldn't have that speaker on stage. That would not be consistent with our principles of open forum. And so when there is disruption, when there is shouting down people, when there is blocking people from entering an event, that would not be consistent with our values. So we love you to be activists. We want you to be activists. Take any issue you want outside of the university, but it's important to us that we're not violating the very principles on which the university is founded.
I was just going to add one more piece to that, is that the professor in me will often talk to students about strategies, right? And looking at scholarship that says what is an effective way to be an activist. So I'll sometimes ask students about what outcome are they trying to achieve. Is it better to write an op-ed piece, or maybe do fundraising, or maybe protest in a visible location? And so I think about some of my students that have done work in Peru and wanted to advocate for indigenous people's rights. And there's different strategies. So part of it is encouraging my students to think about what their goal is, and then the best way to get there. And it's going to be highly contextual. So helping because I want to encourage, that my students to be effective activists for the goals that they're trying to achieve. So sometimes I like to just help them think it through.
Microphone is coming.
Hi, I'm Puya. I'm a senior. So something that I've always been struggling with is that when it comes to debates, especially about human rights, for me, there's always a wrong and right side. Like, for example, when you're asking people who hold marginalized identities to debate with people who are against their very existence and they're against their rights and their happiness. So, like, as a youth chapter and as a student debating with my peers, like, I always struggle with that. And my thing is, debate is always in academia forgets the real issues that people face. Like, it's just like a fun activity that we have the privilege to engage in, to debate about rights, but these are like lived experiences and the pain that people go through. So my question is, like, what do you think the university should do, and what's the university's role in supporting marginalized students so that they don't have to be put through debating and fighting for their own rights?
Can you, before you sit down, can you offer a specific debate where that's been really painful?
Not something that, like, I've spoken with a lot of students about the Black Lives Matter versus, like, the Blue Lives Matter, and, like, why, like I don't think Blue Lives Matter is a valid movement, because I think it was as a reactionary movement to silence and invalidate the real pain and struggles of Black people and the violence sanctioned against them. So, like, I think asking Black students to, like, talk about, like, support, like, have to defend their right to not only live but to be happy and free in this country, I think it's a lot. And a debate that I can think of is, like, trans rights. There are a lot of people in this world who don't think it's a valid identity, that they think it's a joke. So, like, asking people who are trans to engage in those conversations, I think it's a lot. So my question is, like, as a community, as university, what can we do so that the onus and the burden is not on people with those marginalized identities to have to defend themselves? So.
Thank you for that question.
So I'll add one comment on that. I think when you think about core values that Vanderbilt stands for, the core value of diversity and inclusion is really at the center of a lot of things that we do, right? And Jacob commented on that. It's like we so pride ourselves that we have a diverse and thriving student body that represents all sorts of different backgrounds, experiences, identities, points of view. I think overall we're doing really well on that. Now, it's very difficult to engage in the types of issues that you've talked about, particularly when you have experienced discrimination, hostility, hate on a personal basis. And it's our responsibility, I think, is to make sure that every member of our community, including those that come from marginalized identities, feel fully part of the university and fully feel a sense of belonging. That is not easy. Okay? That's not easy. And it's something where every student, no matter what their background is, almost always requires something special, okay, or something direct on that. So you were talking about trans students, right? They have a particular set of challenges. Students that come, from poor backgrounds, or first-generation students, they have a particular set of struggles or challenges. People that come from international, they have a particular, because they know, they're arriving here, they know the culture and all of that. And so this is a crucially important thing, is for us to make sure that everybody feels welcome, and when there are obstacles and barriers, that we remove them, and that we're really able to make sure that everybody can fully thrive here. Now, there will be issues that touch on the questions of identity, and of course they become particularly relevant and important when questions of identity connect with questions of rights and questions of policy. And my hope would be is that when we're dealing with those questions, is that there's always a commitment to understanding, okay? Before we judge and before we say this is this side and the other, that there's a commitment to understanding. And I think we're very quick as a country, hopefully not in the Vanderbilt community, but in a country, is to basically, create this kind of with me or without me, or against me. You're either with me or against me thing, and then if you're not with me, then you're some kind of an immoral person. And then I have to fight you. And I think this is the most important aspect. And having, you brought us this example, right? It's true that students that come from a marginalized community, right, that they may have the burden to talk about their experience in this case, but they're also providing a tremendous service to other students, because that allows them to understand and create more of a sense of empathy and understanding than they may have if they've never been, if this is not anything that they have thought about before, experienced before. So I think a sense of understanding, empathy, and also I think a sense of kindness and gentleness with each other, that we're trying to make sure we understand that and support each other, in particular in these situations which are very charged, very personal, and very difficult for people.
Yeah, no, so one of my favorite quotes is by Frederick Douglass, who said that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And I think that, so in that sense, I would say that free speech is probably the most important human right of all, because whether it's racial justice, whether it's climate change, whatever cause you believe in, the way to argue for your position, to stake your claim for acceptance, tolerance, is to use speech, right? You want to convince other people. You want to shine a light on injustice, on discrimination. You want to petition politicians. You want to convince your neighbors, your peers, that they need to change their minds on a given problem. And if you look at countries where minorities are treated better, they tend also to be countries where free speech is respected the most. Now, then there's another more thorny question. So you mentioned Black Lives Matter, for instance, and you say that it's not fair to ask black students, for instance, to defend themselves. But black students might have a wide variety of different opinions on this matter. So if there's a question of racial justice, what does that mean? Does it mean reparations? Does it mean affirmative action? If so, affirmative action to what degree? Those are all questions that should be discussed in a democracy. They are part and parcel of whatever solution you will eventually agree on, that will have to be adopted by a political process. So that is something that must necessarily be discussed. I don't think you can avoid that discussion. But I think how I think about it in terms of when I defend the position that even bigots should have a right to free speech, I also think that I have a moral obligation to condemn racists or use my own free speech to condemn racists, and B, show solidarity with those who are being subjected to racism and bigotry, so that it doesn't become this sort of very theoretical and abstract principle, free speech. So that's a moral obligation. That is not something that can be legislated. Yeah.
Jad,
Yeah,
we have
please.
time? So thank you for your question. What I wanted to add is, I'm going to try to connect some things. So I was kind of half joking when I talked about my stance on principal neutrality, and I'm going to take both the Merkel and the Eleanor Roosevelt stance and say that it shifts at times, right? So I think about kind of nationally, right, and my kind of Eleanor Roosevelt stance, right? And in the classroom, there are moments when maybe I'm thinking a little bit like Merkel, because I'm very cognizant of maybe burdens that can be placed on students, right? And there are techniques that I can deploy as a professor, either, as you said, to call out racist behaviors, or I assign articles, right? So that the work is done through reading rather than putting the burden on an individual student. So like one concrete example I can give is I can use archaeology. Talking about the past tends to disarm people, right? Because it's like, it's not us. I'm talking about these people that lived 1,000 years ago on the north coast of Peru. They're called the Moche. And there were third genders and very fluid sexual identities. Like the Spanish were abhorred when they arrived and saw these behaviors. But it was a way of teaching students through a culture that lived technically 1,400 years ago about different ways of being, right? And that the ways that what today seems so natural and normal to us is something that has been culturally cultivated, right? And when you start reading about other ways of being, it can open up students' minds to see of the diversity, like the diverse ways that we express either our sexual identity, our gender identity, other aspects of our identity. And so I feel like my work as a professor is to try to provide a variety of venues to see those different ways of being, and so that the burden, it's exhausting, right? The burden isn't always on a marginalized student. And I can assure you that professors talk about this a lot and try to find creative ways to simultaneously educate. So it's, so there's an academic component, yes, but it's not just about academics. I get your point, right? It feels like it's so highfalutin and academic, and what about our lived experiences? But our job is really to try to connect these deep readings, these peer-reviewed journal articles that we have, and make them relevant to students' lived experiences. And that's something that we're always attempting to do. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we need to improve, right? But this is where the feedback from students is really important, so that we can continue to improve the manner in which we kind of create these spaces for open forum and recognizing the diversity, the diverse ways of being.
Okay. I'm tempted to continue to follow up on your question, because it's a very important question. But we are at time, and as I mentioned, this conversation will continue. You all will be sharing it with incoming first-year students. I'm fairly certain this is not the last time we will address this here at Vanderbilt. I want to close by thanking all of y'all for being here, thanking our panelists, Jacob Mchangama, Professor Tiffany Tung, and Chancellor Daniel Diermeier. Thank you all for your wisdom and experience, for inviting me to moderate, and for making space for this important conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.